So thanks for being here tonight, everybody, and hi to everyone on Zoom. Thank you for your vote of confidence in the new board. I hope I live up to your expectations.
See what we can do about the light.
Okay, why isn't my slide advancing already?
That's good. That's good. Is that good? Or you want more light? She wants to.
Can people see okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the topics that Jim McGrath and I are going to cover tonight. Jim is going to start out talking about invasive weed management, and then I'm going to take over and talk about the more fun stuff.
Oh, come on. Everybody loves dealing with invasive weeds. Okay, as Donna said, I'm going to be talking about invasive weed management in Gila National Forest. And I'm going to start off by talking about the basic principles of invasive weed management. The bottom line is what we want to do is prevent small populations from becoming big ones. And the reason for that is that it's far more expensive in terms of time, money, and personnel, the larger the infestation is. So the Forest Service likes to use this little, I don't know what you call it, but it's EDRR. Stands for Early Detection Rapid Response, which is a great idea because naturally, if you can find these invasive weed infestations when the infestations are small, you can get rid of them, right, as soon as possible. But there's a catch. This is a national forest, and it's really big. So there's so much time you have, and even more so in a wilderness because of the logistical issues associated with going into a wilderness. So we left with two different kinds of strategies that we deal with in invasive weed management. And one of them is eradication, obviously. If we can eradicate the infestation, we do so. But sometimes those populations, those infestations get too big. So then we have to depend on control, which means we keep the populations or the infestations from spreading into new areas. So we in the Gila National Forest, we have a three-phase strategy in dealing with invasive weeds. The first phase is inventory. We need to know where the infestations are. And then secondly, we need to engage in treatment somehow. And then finally, we have to monitor those infestations. And which of those three is the most important? It's the monitoring. Because you can't just go out to a site and wipe out all of those infestation one time. It's not over because the seeds are probably still in the soil. So you have to keep coming back periodically, annually, or at least periodically, and make sure you have that infestation under control. Okay, now first I'm going to talk about our Gila National Forest success story. And that's about salt cedar, also known as tamarisk.
Just pause for a minute. We have a technical difficulty.
Go ahead. I'll work on it. Not even on Zoom.
Don't wait for me, I may be forever.
The screen is not being shown to the Zoom participants, so we're trying to fix that.
Ooh, look at all of them. See if they see it.
Yeah, I don't understand why that would be a problem.
That's why he's up here.
Yes, I know that. You're sure not gonna ask me to fix it.
No, I'm not. I'm just explaining. Okay.
Did you get it?
That's good.
It's done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Russ.
All right, so back to our salt cedar or tamarisk success story. Well, Gila National Forest has been dealing with salt cedar for 15 years. For about the first 6 or 7 years, from 2009 to 2015, the forest itself did some treatment of salt cedar. And then from 2016 to 2024 to date, the Upper Gila Watershed Alliance is one of our partners. And they have been doing the treatment of salt cedar in the Gila National Forest. So let me look at this next one. I can't remember which one it is right off the top. Come on, Squirty Gadget. Okay, it's not moving.
See what I need to do to get you. Well, it just moved.
It did. Oh, okay, it did. Okay. Sorry.
Wow, that was fast, easy.
I'm not mechanically inclined. Okay, anyway, so with the salt cedar, we have to use an herbicide. So why is that? Well, because the plant grow, a lot of you probably are familiar with salt cedar. I sure am, because I used to live in the Albuquerque area. But anyway, it resprouts. And so that means you can't cut or remove the top part of the plant to get rid of it. You have to take out the entire root system. And so that's a problem. And so the simplest way, I mean, for especially since much of what we're looking at is in the Gila wilderness itself, and you have to maintain wilderness character. So you can't go in with a backhoe, obviously. So what you do is where you're using we had to develop an environmental assessment that dates to 2006. And so what we wound up doing with that environmental assessment is we're using Garlon 3A, which is a water-soluble herbicide, and we use a cut stump method. That means they cut the salt cedar stems, and then with a paintbrush or a handheld spray bottle, they spray that cut surface. So what does that do? It minimizes any of the pollution of that herbicide going into the air, the soil, or the water. Okay, so let's go to the next one, and let's take a look at what UGWA has been doing. That's what Upper Gila Watershed Alliance goes by. It's UGWA for short. And this map is showing you where waypoints have been established by Upper Gila Watershed Alliance from 2016 through 2023. Now, there's two red lines on the right. That's Highway 15 and Highway 35. So what I want you to look at is this. That's the Gila River, the main stem of the Gila River, and you can see waypoints all along that entire length. Plus, we also have waypoints up on the Middle Fork and the East Fork. All right, so now let's see how successful UGWA has been. So I can tell you that from 2016 to 2023, the total number of waypoints treated was 602. The total number of stems treated was 11,860. And then back before through 2021, Scott Zager is the GIS guy with UGWA. And so he calculated from the data what the percentage of treated stems that were eradicated was. And he came up with 89%. That's pretty good. Yeah. Folks, 89% eradicated. Yes, sir.
Can we ask questions? Or,
We can if it's not too long, otherwise at the end.
no, I was in Moab and they were using some insects, a caterpillar or something for salt cedar. Has that been tried here or
No,
you know anything about that or?
I do.
Oh,
I'll just briefly respond to that. If you want to talk about that later. As Donna knows, I am not a big fan of biological control. That's a method that they use called the Diarrhea beetle. And they introduced that up in Utah and I don't know where else. And it's spread south, but it hasn't got down here that I know of. And I do know, I'm just not big on it because invariably when they establish these biological controls, they'll say about how good it is, but it always turns out that there's something they didn't figure out, and here it's affecting native plants. So for example, I probably should have saved this question to the end, but anyway, I'm on a roll here. So when you consider in the Lincoln National Forest, we have a threatened species there called Cirsium vinaceum. It's the Sacramento Mountains thistle. Okay. Well, there's a beetle that was introduced, a biological control that was supposed to feed on the noxious weed thistles, which I'll be talking about, but naturally it started slipping towards the Sacramento Mountains thistle. So that's why I'm not a fan of biological control. Okay, so let's see, but 89%, that's pretty good. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I just couldn't remember what the next slide was. But I do want to emphasize this. How successful was this? Well, I can tell you that Heart of the Gila, that's HOTG for short. Heart of the Gila is our other partner. And they had a subcontractor that hiked the distance from Grapevine Campground. Let's see if I could backstep here to the map. So from here, all the way to the exit of the wilderness boundary. He was looking for other invasive plants, but he only saw in May of 2023, 2 salt cedar plants.
Right.
They were pretty successful with this strategy, but a lot of it's because they've been working on it for so long. So let's go on to purple loosestrife. I'm not going to say much about that. Donna's going to talk about how we've been treating it. But this plant, as you can see, that tall rose purple flower stalk, it's a spike. This plant grows on the edge of Lake Roberts. It is the only location in the state of well, at least in the Gila National Forest where this noxious weed is found. It is a much worse problem in other states like back east. They have to use herbicides there. We don't totally eradicate it. We just keep it under control, and Donna will tell you more about that. So that's all I'm going to say about purple loosestrife. It's a nasty one, but so far not a problem here. And we don't use an herbicide with that one. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a couple thistles. And I especially want to mention thistles because one of our pet peeves with our botanists, us botanists, is we want the public to know that not most thistles are native thistles. So you have to know how to distinguish the noxious wheat thistles from the native ones. So this one I'm showing you here is bull thistle. This is probably our most serious infestation in Gila, invasive weed in Gila National Forest. So I'm going to point out, you'll notice the flowers up at the top, and beneath it is an involucre. Your native plant folks, you know what I mean by an involucre. And those are bracts, and at the tip of each one of those bracts is a spine, but notice how narrow they are. And then on this picture on the right is how you tell bull thistle from all other thistles. Those tiny little bristles, they gotta be bristles poking upward from the leaf surface, the upper leaf surface only, is diagnostic for bull thistle. And I'll talk about how we treat it in a bit, but first let's go to the next one. Here's musk thistle. Musk thistle is easily distinguished because, as I mentioned on the other one with the narrow bracts, these are rather broad, triangular, purplish triangular bracts, and the heads are typically nodding. This one can grow very tall over my head. Sometimes they're not that tall. But anyway, that's how you tell musk thistle. We have been finding it growing along with bull thistle, by the way. So we treat both of them. And one reason I'm talking about both of them at this time is because they're both biennial thistles. That means they got the same growth pattern. So what does that mean? Okay, they live for only 2 years. First year they occur as a rosette. That is to say, a circle of leaves flattened against the ground. And then the second year they put out stems, leaves, and flowers and seeds. And then it dies by the end of the year. So if you catch it in the second year, you don't need to kill it. It's going to die at the end of the year anyway. So what we do, our treatment method is to dig up a rosette with shovel. Might have to modify that in the wilderness. We'll talk about that in a bit. But otherwise, we can dig those out with a shovel. We remove the stems and branches. We cut them off, leave them there to decompose on the ground. But prior to flowering, if the plants have already flowered, then we cut the flowered heads off, dump them in a bag, and take them to a dumpster off-site. So that's how we treat these biennial thistles. We do not have to use herbicides. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about invasive weeds in wilderness. And we have 3 wilderness areas in the Gila National Forest. The first 2, I'm going to talk about, I've been tasked over the last 2.5 years to develop invasive weed management plans to deal with invasive weeds in these 3 wilderness areas. Well, in the blue and the Aldo, I've already finished those plans. So I'm going to talk about those briefly. Blue Range Wilderness is some small wilderness west of Highway 180 and west of the Gila Wilderness. But we had surveyors go in there, and now I got to emphasize something. Should be pretty obvious that we can't have surveyors survey the entire wilderness. That's obvious. So what we do is we focus on places where humans and stock animals tread, because they are major dispersers of invasive weeds. And so we had surveyors survey the Blue Range Wilderness by hiking the trails. And then we also, just outside the wilderness, we surveyed areas around the trailheads, nearby campgrounds, corrals, and roads, things of that nature. So, but what we found, I'm only going to talk about this briefly, but the Blue Range Wilderness doesn't have an invasive weed problem. We only found 2 bull thistle plants in the whole wilderness during their surveying back in 2017. Those both were removed by the surveyors. In the Aldo, we surveyed for that in 2018. Same pattern of surveying. With the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, we found basically 1 significant area with a major infestation of bull thistle in the Mimbres River just before it exits the wilderness, or not just before, but in the southwest corner of that wilderness. So in that case, those thistles, we have not gone back to them since we found them. But there's been a problem that developed. We had the Black Fire of 2022, which burned about 95% of the wilderness. So we need to get back there and see what happened to that infestation, and eventually there may be some other invasive weeds to deal with. And now I'm going to talk about the Gila Wilderness. More specifically, I'm currently working on an invasive weed management plan for that. In there, we have really serious infestations. So let's talk about them. Okay, well, I already talked about salt cedar. That's one of them. It was all over the main stem, as we pointed. All of that was in the Gila Wilderness. From Grapevine Campground on Highway 15 to the wilderness boundary and on the 2 forks. And we're still treating it, by the way. We have to. So we have another partner. It's called Heart of the Gila. Heart of the Gila surveyed mostly by hiking, the trails. They had some modifications of it along the river, but they hiked the trails in the Gila Wilderness, surveying for invasive weeds. So I'm showing you a picture of all the trails in the Gila Wilderness. I'm not exactly sure if they surveyed every single one of those trails, but I do know Heart of the Gila surveyed 525 miles of trail in the Gila Wilderness. So what did they find? Let's take a look. Well, before I do that, this slide I'm talking about the strategies used for surveying and treating invasive weeds in a wilderness. Not the same thing. It's outside the wilderness. First of all, the obvious thing is difficulty of access. So it's nice to think about doing EDRR, but you may be doing a backpack trip to hike 10 miles to survey for this. All of that takes preparation. You have to deal with tangled vegetation because the UGWA subcontractor has told me most of the trail along the main stem of the river, it doesn't exist. Or it's been so grown over that it's just all tangled vegetation. So you have to deal with that. Then, of course, we all know you can't use motorized equipment or mechanized transport. And then finally, and this is very important, we have to maintain wilderness character. That's real important. So how do you define wilderness character? Well, it's defined as a combination of the biophysical, observed, and symbolic qualities that distinguishes a wilderness from all other public lands. So it's not just the ecosystem and maintaining the ecological processes, it's also literally the appearance of it as well. So this turns out to be a big deal because we have to minimize disturbance to the ground, among other things, if we're treating things physically. Okay, so let's go and look at, going to show you now the distribution, we have 5 additional invasive weeds in the Gila wilderness. So this is bull thistle. And so I'm going to point out a few things here. As you can see, there's a very large glob of dots in this portion of the wilderness, the northwest corner. Well, guess where that is? That's in the whitewater baldy scar, fire scar. That's one thing I know that's kind of common for that. And then I'll point out 2 other locations where there's dense infestations. This is actually the east fork of the Gila River. And it's, it's about 3 miles from the confluence with the main stem by Grapevine Campground. And then this is Black Canyon just before it enters the East Fork. And then finally, this infestation is basically in Black Canyon. And you can see it actually extends across the boundary into those campgrounds in Black Canyon. So it's quite a wide distribution of bull thistle in the wilderness. So, all right, let's look at poison hemlock is another noxious weed. And by the way, what we use in Gila National Forest, the weeds that we decide to survey for are on the state noxious weed list. So this is poison hemlock. And there's a lot of plants in the parsley family that have flowers with that same flower pattern. But, and this plant tends to have fern-like leaves, but so do a lot of plants in the parsley family. But the identifying feature is it tends to have purplish blotches on the stems. And this plant could grow over your heads. So that one's, so what do we do with now? As it turns out, this has got the same growth pattern as the thistles. It's a biennial. So we don't have to use an herbicide to get rid of this. But it turns out it's pretty widely distributed. All right, so what you're looking at here, look how many, this is all on the main stem of the Gila River from Grapevine Campground to the wilderness boundary, all of it. So some of the surveyors, when they were out there, they were able to treat small infestations of bull thistle and this one. And they basically just pull it out. Or they may remove the rosettes with a hand tool. Because remember, we have to maintain wilderness character, so we have to be careful about how much ground we actually disturb. Okay, so let's go to this one. I'm going to talk about these 2 together. Somebody have a question?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about these 2 together. This is Siberian elm. I would imagine most of you are familiar with this. All you got to do is go down to the ditch. This photo is probably from Minnesota, but there are trees down there that have those kind of curved upper branches. And most of those Siberian elms we see are smaller trees and whatnot. And then I'm going to show you the distribution though. This one is a tricky one because this plant is going to require using an herbicide. And see how widely distributed it is? What you see right here, this is Sapio Creek where it empties into the main stem of the Gila River. So from this location, 2 or 3 miles above that confluence to the wilderness boundary, there's extensive populations of this Siberian elm. And then there's 2 other spots I'll point out here. This one is in a place called 3 Mile Ruin on the West Fork. There's over 11-acre site with Siberian elm. And that one over there is, that dot there is actually, I think it's only a single tree in Black Canyon. And so that one's not that serious, but this one we think is treatable. This is going to be a challenge. So now let me just talk about, Tree of Heaven. I said I wanted to talk about both of them simultaneously. This is Tree of Heaven. If you've been down in the ditch, I would expect most of you know what this looks like. But good news on this, folks. We have only one infestation.
Wow.
About 1/4 of an acre at the junction of Fall Canyon and the main stem of the Gila River. So that one I think is treatable, and both of these, well, let's go and look at the treatment methods. And okay, so it's basically the same thing as salt cedar. They resprout. You can't remove the top of it and hope you solve the problem. Doesn't work. You're going to have, the treatments are similar to salt cedar. You're going to have to use an herbicide, but we can't do it right now because the EA that was developed in 2006 only covers salt cedar. So we're gonna have to develop a new environmental assessment to address these two species. And actually, Donna has told me they're gonna include Russian olive also. Some of that is present, and it's not in the Gila Wilderness. I'm not sure where it is. It's up on Bear Canyon somewhere, I think. But anyway, we're gonna try to do a new EA. And again, emphasizing that whatever, we'll probably use the same one, Garland 3A. Works pretty effectively on salt cedar, use the similar type methods, cut stump or girdling, so that you minimize pollution to air, water, and soil. Okay, let's see what I got left. Okay, this is the last one. This is cheatgrass. So what I'm gonna tell you about cheatgrass, it produces a whole bunch of huge amounts of seed. And it also is easily dispersed. The plants are very hairy, as are the seeds. And so they're easily dispersed by animals, humans, and so on. And I'm going to tell you that in Utah and Nevada, this is a really serious problem because it will form very dense stands over large areas. And then the plant dries out and becomes a fire hazard. And when those fires come through, it actually causes the population to expand. So it's a huge problem there. But in New Mexico, that problem hasn't developed here. And that's a good thing because this plant, cheatgrass, has been found all along the main stem of the Gila River, 3/4 of the way to the exit at the wilderness boundary. And then it's also extensive on the Middle Fork. And surveyors I've seen descriptions, well, there's small patches, there's little patches, and then there's some occur, but the bottom line is, it's here to stay. We're not gonna treat this. As long as it's not causing that problem in Utah and Nevada, we'll have to live with cheatgrass. Okay, so I think I have one last thing to show is, now that we've found where the populations are, we need to get after it and treat them. And I once again emphasize, we have to maintain consistent and persistent monitoring to make sure we keep these plants either eradicated or under control. And now I'm going to turn it back to Donna.
He doesn't have as good a memory as Jim, and I need notes. So Jim got to tell you the bad news, and I get to tell you some of the good news. Just more fun. I want to talk about some of the accomplishments that we did this summer, 2024, in the field season, treating the plants that Jim talked about, bull thistle, musk thistle, and purple loosestrife. This is the San Francisco River just upstream of Reserve. And you can't really tell in this photo, but there is a pretty huge population here of mostly musk thistle, but also bull thistle. This is musk thistle right here at the front of this photo. And so Jim and I were there in early July looking at all this musk thistle with the guy who works for the Reserve District. And then in mid-July, a group of 11 Forest Service employees went back there, and we used the method that Jim talked about to work on getting rid of these. We didn't get rid of all of them, but we sure didn't do them any favors. So all the flower heads we popped off, they come off really easily, actually. Put those in bags. You can see the bag there with that purple stuff is the flowering heads. And then we dug out the basal rosettes so that next year they won't grow into plants, flowering stalks. And then we cut the plant down and just left it there because, it's not going to continue to grow. This is a freebie. I just had to put this in because, hiding amongst all those thistle leaves was this snake that had a rodent in its mouth. So it's jungly out there. This is our crew. We got chased off by a thunderstorm, which isn't really apparent in this photo. It doesn't look very bad, but we were about to get dumped on, and we were also really tired. It's hard work. So after several hours of doing this, we stopped. Here's the Tularosa River. This is a few miles upstream of where it flows into the San Francisco River. Just a few miles away from the town of Reserve. Really beautiful little canyon. Excuse me. The reason we went there is because the Forest Service has been doing a stream restoration project there. So there used to be a stream crossing. I mean, they call the Tularosa a river. It's very small. But there used to be a stream crossing that a concrete slab that prevented fish from moving up and downstream. And so last summer, 2023, the Forest Service removed that and put in a crossing that fish can actually navigate. And in the course of doing that work, discovered that there were a lot of bull and musk thistle out there. So you can see them here, and they're mixed in with some native plants. I think the yellow is cowpen daisy, and then that tall purple one on the right is the Rocky Mountain bee plant. So there is a group called Conservation Corps New Mexico, and they were out there in mid-September, a group of young people, and they were out there digging, digging out the basal rosettes, cutting off the flowering heads. A lot of them had already gone to seed, so they collected those and put those in bags. In this photo, you can see a bunch of the flowering stalks that they just cut and left in place. And then, this is the crew looking fresh because they haven't started yet. And then this picture shows the confluence of Apache Creek and the Tularosa, a few miles upstream of the other Tularosa River photo. This is a huge infestation of bull and musk thistle, mostly musk thistle. Put that out of the way. And so the crew went here too, and they spent a couple of days here. I know they didn't finish because there was way too much for anybody to accomplish in 2 days. And they did the same procedure that we've talked about and how to get rid of those. So Apache Creek and Tularosa River is right by the intersection of highways 32 and 12. If you've ever been to Apache Creek Campground, it's basically right there. It's gorgeous, actually, except for these. So in addition to the Conservation Corps New Mexico and Forest Service people, the Forest Service also works with other partners to accomplish some critical work. In this case, this is New Mexico Wild or New Mexico Wilderness Alliance. And they treated that 40+ acre infestation that's on the Whitewater Baldy Trail in the Whitewater Baldy burn scar. You can see that in this photo that they are using the Native Plant Society's Thistle Guide. If you guys haven't seen this guide, it is really great. It is on the Native Plant Society's website. You can just download it and.
It's on our website too.
Yes, thanks. And it really helps you to tell those thistles apart because at first glance, they all look the same, but they aren't all the same. And so in this photo, Scott Zager, who some of you may know, a really good botanist, Scott Zager volunteered to help me in early August to go out to Willow Creek Campground. That's Scott with the red cap there. And we did a thistle ID training for the New Mexico Wild crew because they couldn't tell the thistles apart. And this was a really good place for us to do the training, in addition to being this gorgeous campground where they got to hang out for a few days. It also has some native thistles, at least a couple of native thistles. So we were able to show them the native thistle and the non-native thistle, the one that Jim showed that had those tiny little hairs on the top of the leaf. It's a really good diagnostic character. And then we went to Gila Creek too. This isn't Gila Creek. We went to Gila Creek also to show them some more, just to work with them for a few hours till we knew that they had it down and could go off on their own. So this is actually on in the Whitewater Baldy burn scar on the Whitewater Baldy Trail. You can see all the dead trees in the back. It's one of the wilderness rangers hamming it up for the camera. And then to talk about purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicarium, that that Jim mentioned. As far as we know, like Jim said, the only place that it occurs in the Gila is at Lake Roberts. It's mostly on the southeast end of Lake Roberts. And so in late August, the Gila National Forest fish biologist went out there with a young intern to get rid of purple loosestrife, and they pulled it. And you can see their kayaks here. And so because they had kayaks, they were able to survey the whole lake and make sure they got it. You could see in the back of the truck, they really didn't get that much. And to me, that's attributable to the fact that the Forest Service is going out there every year and getting rid of these things. So now I get to talk about rare plants, which is way more fun than invasive plants. So this is Penstemon McCaffei. This is Andrew Tree's photo. So in July, I had the great pleasure to go on a plant expedition with Andrew Tree. Some of you probably know Andrew. He's a phenomenal plant photographer. And he also has sort of a photographic memory for where he has seen plants. So we didn't have to look, we just had to walk to get there. This is on the Crest Trail from Emery Pass to Hillsborough Peak. We didn't get to Hillsborough Peak because this is just inside the Aldo Leopold Wilderness boundary. A few things I wanted to say about rare plants. This is where I might need to check my notes. So it says here on the slide that the Gila National Forest has no federally listed threatened or endangered species. So those are plants that would be listed under the Endangered Species Act. And that, I think, is partly due to the fact that it's really hard to get plants and animals listed. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the federal agency that's responsible for listing plants, and they have this really big backlog of candidate species. So it isn't easy to get something on that list. And for the Gila in particular, one of our problems is something that Jim mentioned earlier. It's a vast area to survey. It's very remote. It's rugged. When people are out there, they're usually staying on the trails. They're not going down these super steep slopes, most people. The people who are doing that probably don't know about plants. So, there'd be like 20-year-olds who can still do those kinds of things, right? But they don't know their plants, probably. So there's a lot of uncertainty about really how rare are the plants that we think are rare. And a lot of these plants, the same thing that makes them really difficult to survey is also what makes them somewhat protected. It's hard to get to them. And so people don't. And so we don't really have a good sense of how widespread they are. I did want to mention here that if there is a plant, if the Gila National Forest is proposing to do a project in an area that has rare plants, it would have to go through the NEPA process. So NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. It's the Nixon era law that mandates that federal agencies take a hard look at adverse impacts of any project or policy that they want to implement. So for instance, if they wanted to do a project in a place that has rare plants, they would have to go through this process, really, do an assessment. And if the project would be deemed to harm any rare plants, they would either have to modify the project, mitigate it, or just not do it at all. So there are some protections built in to protect some rare plants. Just another Penstemon McCaffei photo, just kind of to show you the growth habit there on the left. Again, these are Andrew Tree's photos, and you will be treated to some of mine that aren't quite as good. Don't look, Elroy. So I just said that there aren't any threatened and endangered species, but there are 21 species of conservation concern that have been identified by the Gila National Forest. And they are listed in the final forest plan, which is right now in the objection phase, but we expect it to be finalized, signed, and implemented early next year. There's 21 species, but I broke them up into 3 slides so you can actually read them. And I'm only going to talk about 4 of these. So there's the first 7. On this slide, I will only be talking about Gila morning glory. Here's the next 7. And there's a couple on there that one I've already mentioned, Metcalf's penstemon. And then these are the last 7. There's 21 of them. And now you get to see some pictures of them. So this is Scrophularia macrantha. Mimbris figwort or red figwort are common names for it. It's endemic to the Gila, which means it doesn't grow anywhere else, just here in the Gila. So we're special because it's a beauty. Again, this is an Andrew tree photo. So one of the ways that the Forest Service is protecting some rare plants is by working with another partner, the Institute for Applied Ecology. They're a nonprofit based in Santa Fe, and they have been collecting seeds for some of these rare plants. I'll talk about that more in just a minute. This is my photo. You can see it's out of focus. This is Ipomea Gilana, the Gila morning glory, which has been discovered or rediscovered in the last decade or so, maybe 12 years ago. It's in the Black Range. And in August, I went out with 3 botanists from the Institute for Applied Ecology to look for this. I mean, we knew where it was basically, but once we got out there, then we had to kind of scout around to find it. And you could see that it's growing on oaks. That's an oak on the right, a gray oak. And it was all the ones that we saw were vines. So it was vining up gray oaks. In my defense, I'll have to say that they were already closed for the day, even though it wasn't very late because it was hot. So I said that the Gila National Forest is protecting some rare plants by working with partners. One of these partners is Institute for Applied Ecology, and they are collecting seeds for these 5 rare plants, also some very common ones. But these rare ones, they've gotten funding from the Forest Service to look for these plants and to collect the seeds. And I had the good fortune to go out in early October with a young woman, a botanist, Roxanne Marquez, who works for them. And she showed me the seed collection protocol. It was really quite rigorous, and I learned a lot from her. This is what she said about what they do with the seeds. 65% of the seeds they collect are for growing out to produce yet more seeds of these rare plants. 15% of the seeds are used in long-term seed banking, and then the remaining 20% go for research. So this was my hands down favorite field experience this summer, is getting to see the yellow lady slipper. I mean, you really have to work to see this plant. It was a 15-hour day for us. That included driving. But it was so worth it. This is for the Holy Grail, and I've been wanting to see it for 20 years and just mostly out of inertia, never got there. But, you really have to work to get there. It's up Little Creek, which flows into the West Fork. And it grows on this cliff face that people call the Hanging Garden, because there must be a spring at the top of it, and there's all this water coming down. And it's amazing. It's just this profusion of plant life. It is so gorgeous. And I went out there with 2 Forest Service colleagues and also with Harpo Faust, who's the UNM Herbarium Collections Manager. Is that her title? Collections Manager. And I told Harpo at the end of the day that she's part mountain goat. Because we got there and I was like, I walked all this way and I still don't see the yellow lady slipper. I was so disappointed. And Harpo walks up this almost vertical cliff and she's like, woo-hoo, it's up here. It's like, okay, I guess I'm going up there. So I did. And then one of my colleagues took this picture of me up there looking happy.
Yeah.
Great, thank
So I'm going to move on to a Forest Service restoration project at Cherry Creek. This is off Highway 15, right near the turnoff to the Signal Peak Road. There's this really sweet little meadow, wet meadow down there that I've looked at for many, many years. And I was really glad to know that the Forest Service was doing a restoration project there because the creek was really cutting down. And so in 2022, they contracted with a stream restoration guy to come in with heavy equipment, and he put in these huge boulders. They look very natural. Like if you didn't know it was a stream restoration project, you might not notice that it's man-made work. It looks very natural. And then the Forest Service 3 years in a row has been planting native plants to jumpstart the recovery. And so in mid-July, Jim and I went out there with these two young interns you see here, brothers. They were great. Taking a little break here. And Jim and I decided where all these things should be planted after arguing about it a little bit. We more or less a consensus. And then we planted some plants. These two young kids did most of the work actually, but we did some. And then I went back there in October to see what was still alive, because we flagged everything. So we knew what had been planted in which year. So of the 58 plants that we planted this year, 43 of them were surviving in October. That's in addition to 99 plants that were planted in 2023 that are still alive, and 11 from 2022 that still are alive. So I think, all the gardeners in this audience can appreciate how hard it is to keep plants alive if you're not watering them. So, I mean, the monsoons were adequate or sort of okay this year, but they weren't great, right?
No, they weren't.
So I'll show you a couple plants that did make it through to October. Silene laciniata or campion or catchfly, a lot of common names. Agasace pallidiflora also made it through. Again, these are my photos, so, slightly out of focus, although Jim told me not to say that. Don't say they're out of focus. Okay, so these are all the thank yous for the photos. This is for Jim's part of the presentation. And then these are all the people that I need to thank for photos. You can see all the lovely photos in there are, somebody else's. And that's it for our presentation. So if people have questions, we will try to answer them. You can direct them towards Jim or me or either one if you don't know. So, anybody?
you. Great, thank you.
Russ,
Donna, when you went to the,
I can't hear you. We're deaf.
when you went to the Cypripedium site, you had to go up that hillside and there were none left at the bottom at the creek level.
We didn't see any at the bottom.
That's too bad because.
Oh,
20 years.
is that where they've been?
20 years ago, they would have been at the creek level too.
No, we didn't see any at the bottom. But, I mean, that was early June.
That's when they would have been in bloom.
Maybe later they'd be there. This is Little Creek too, by the way. I took this picture of sedges. Since Jim loves sedges so much. Okay, I saw some other hands, but I forget who. I don't know your name,
Here's the
sorry.
gentleman here.
How do you determine what's an invasive species?
Oh, well, the way with the Forest Service, we use the state noxious weed list. And that's been developed over the years by, the New Mexico Department of Agriculture has developed that noxious weed list. They have had meetings with farmers, ranchers, botanists, whoever is involved, and they make the decisions as to which ones are invasive. You want to know how do we know it's an invasive species?
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, we know it's non-native. And then where they get to be a real problem is when those invasive species actually take over areas. And when they do, and I find this when I was trying to think, well, what do these invasive weed species actually do to the ecosystem? And it's the same thing for just about each one of them. Well, by doing that, by increasing their numbers, they are depriving other plants from growing, they're outcompeting other plants, and they're disrupting the natural ecosystem and the natural ecological processes. So, and over the years, some of these, like I mentioned about cheatgrass in Utah and Nevada, is a really serious problem there. And this purple loosestrife, not that big a problem here, but apparently it can completely choke ponds and lakes where, it forms a dense root system. It outcompetes the other aquatic plants, and therefore it creates poor wildlife quality. And so, where this happens is that they're non-native species. So they're not adapted as part of the natural ecosystem. And so it happens to be aggressive because they don't have natural checks and balances to keep their population under control. So, does that help?
Well, it does a little bit. I'm just thinking like your thistle, you're saying the bull thistle, but you've got native thistle that's growing with it too. What's the difference? I mean,
Well, the native thistles, first of all, the non-native thistles are not native to this area. They're, come over from Europe and Asia and places like that. And so they're not adapted to the ecosystem. And they tend to be very aggressive, a lot of these invasive weeds. And they're very aggressive, and then they outcompete the native ones. They are out of balance with the ecosystem because they're non-native. Yes, sir. Bill probably has a better answer. Yes.
So these thistles better than I do. The native thistles, you ever see those forming these dense monocultures? The native thistle species, I'm just trying to kind of give a little. Yeah, so think of some of the native thistles around. You ever see them taking over a habitat?
Me? No.
Yeah,
No, that's the bottom line. These have a reputation of forming dense infestations. And that's where the problem comes. It was only 2 or 3 plants.
That musk thistle and that bull thistle can just form big, take over an area.
Yeah, this site that she was talking about at the Apache Creek confluence with Tularosa River is gigantic. That's probably 5 acres. Huge population of musk thistle on the banks of those streams. So there are populations, infestations that get pretty out of hand. So as I said earlier, the way you control it, so the native thistles, we never see them get like that. Usually when I find a thistle, there's usually one or there's a few, but not dense stands of it. You see.
so how many years do they have to say, is it like native if it's here for 200 years or 100 years?
No, it's not native because it's evolved in another part of the world, and then it's been brought over by us humans accidentally, or sometimes intentionally, and then it gets out like salt cedar was probably, I think it was originally supposed to stabilize banks or something like that, but it's, for example, I lived up in Albuquerque before I came here, and salt cedar and Russian olive have completely dominated the floodplain of the Rio Grande because we eliminated natural flooding by creating levees and drains, eliminated all that stuff. And so that opened the door for an invasive to take over. It completely disrupted the ecosystem and the natural ecological processes, which are in balance. Now it's out of balance because they stopped the flooding. Because the flooding is necessary for the seedlings of cottonwood. Cottonwood, the seeds are deposited with floods. They need floods to get started. We stopped the floods. And so I know from living in Albuquerque, and this is why I'm really concerned about Siberian elm in the Gila wilderness. Because I remember working up on Sandia Pueblo, had a contract up there. And their wildlife biologists were thinking, when the cottonwood trees die, and they will die, there are no cottonwood trees coming in unless we go plant them. So they're afraid that once the cottonwoods die, and they may all die more or less at once or something at some time, then Siberian elm is such a prolific seed producer that it may be even worse than salt cedar and Russian owl. So that's where, it's just to emphasize, it doesn't have a, not necessarily in terms of years. It has to do with adaptation. It's in those plants are in balance where they normally occur, let's say in Asia or Europe. You bring them over here, they're out of balance. And if
Nothing
they're
against
aggressive,
them if they're not from here, that our native plants have evolved with insects
right,
over thousands of years. So non-native plants don't host insect larvae. They just are not part of a food web.
right. It's all about that it's not just the plants. It's all the other little animals, the insects, vertebrates, reptiles and amphibians and so on can be affected by whatever these non-native plants do. They may become so dense that it eliminates breeding habitat for a toad or something. And so that's where these get to be a real problem, is when they get out of hand.
Let's see, I think we have some other questions. We should probably move on
Okay,
to the next question. Yeah,
What species are you looking at targeting next?
the same ones.
Okay.
Because you, like Jim said, you got to keep getting after them year after year. And it's not a one and done kind of deal. You got to keep going back. And who knows? I mean, new stuff could come up too. I hope not, but we don't really know that at this point. Yeah, Betty.
Do you know if that Cherry Creek project is going to be continued, or are people gonna go back and plant more, or?
I don't know. We haven't really talked about that for next year. If we're gonna plant more native plants there. What I noticed when I was out there in October is that native plants are starting to come back in on their own. So like I saw plants that didn't have a little flag next to them, which means we didn't plant them. For instance, there were a couple of Fremont cottonwoods growing there, and we didn't plant any cottonwoods. And so, if you get, we just kind of gave it a little bit of a head start, and then I hope that things will just come back in on their own. There were a ton of insects in there too, in just little damp spots in the creek. So it's looking good, even though a bunch of our plants died, and that was kind of discouraging. Yeah.
You guys are walking out the trails into the wilderness. Some of the things I see along the roadside, weeping love grass, layman's love grass.
Yeah.
And you get up in the cliff line, you get ripgut, brome grass. Are you seeing some of these non-native grasses getting a foothold into the wilderness areas?
Cheatgrass,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, there's another
Well,
one.
yeah, I should mention that our partner, Heart of the Gila, they recorded other non-native plants. And ripgut brome is one of them. And I don't know that they really documented weeping lovegrass, although I have noticed that plant likes to follow trails. So I hike the Gomez Creek Trail a lot, and when you start out on that grass that's right next to the trail on both sides, just next to the trail, 4 or 5 feet away from you don't see it. That's weeping lovegrass. But, we've had discussions about whether or not we should be considering these other invasive species. But the forest has been insistent on, we follow the state noxious weed list. And so I understand the concerns about things like ripgut brome. And, but the fact is, what can we deal with? What can we actually treat? Cheatgrass, we can't treat that. And so the ones that we're talking about, I think may be the most serious infestations. And I don't know that we can do, because it all depends on funding, personnel, time. And there's just so much you can actually do. Yes, sir.
Along the same
glasses.
Along the same lines, I looked at those.
What are you doing about mullet? What are we doing about mullet? Oh,
And you can see that there was
Okay, I'll
mullen
answer
in
that.
those same pictures that were not removed. So are you leaving the mullen there as your?
Yes. Now, this is, yeah, I can see that, my colleague, Patrice from the Heart of the Gila is here.
no.
But she is a big advocate of dealing with things like mullen, from what I've heard. But the reality is, I can find that mullen virtually, I can be in some of the remotest places.
Yeah.
And by God, there's this invasive species, it's a non-native plant. And, you can find it in a whole bunch of places, but we don't deal with that one. We just, it's like cheatgrass. I don't believe there's.
Some
anything
of
we
us
can do.
deal with it.
What?
Some of us deal with it.
Well, you can,
Yeah.
you can on a certain level. You know, we even treated some cheatgrass this year ourselves on Highway 15 on the way out to Cherry Creek Restoration Project. We noticed we weren't seeing cheatgrass anywhere except this 130-foot section, which was full of this stuff, about 3 feet wide, 30 feet long. So last year I went out and removed it. Donna and I did it again this year. That was our little contribution. If it's small enough, then yeah, it's feasible. You can actually try to get rid of it. But, when I see what, even Patrice agrees, I believe, about cheatgrass in the wilderness, we can't do anything about it. There's too much of it. And I think the major concern there is
We could continue
Is
questions
the,
over refreshment.
the fact that where it's a really big problem is in those other states where it forms huge stands. If that ever happens here, we got a problem, but so far that hasn't happened. I have not heard any reports that stuff has become really dense stands in the wilderness, burn stars.
Talking about cheatgrass now or?
Yeah, I was talking about cheatgrass.
So it's time, sorry.
We have one more question in the chat.
Oh, the mullen question. Well, I think Jim kind of addressed that. I mean, mullen is everywhere, but I mean, we don't see like a solid stand, a monocrop of mullen. I don't think we're gonna do much with mullen. I mean, yeah, in little places, if you don't want it, sure. But I think it's already, that ship has already sailed. It's already out there.
Well,
Same with dandelion, and they're asking us to stop now, Jim, but if people have more questions.
I would like
we'll be
to,
in
I'd like to
the
respond a little bit more.
Okay,
On mullen, I have seen dense stands in burn scars. But one of the things that I think happens is, and in these burn stars, and Bill can correct me on this, is you got, after a burn, you're gonna have secondary ecological succession. And so my thinking is that as time goes, the other plants that grow to will replace that mullen, where I've seen this up in, the Gila National Forest where I used to work as a volunteer. Anyway, if we were to deal with mullen, that is another major issue if we had to deal with it. Okay, Donna knows I babble too much.